You are looking at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. How about that? Nearly 1,500 feet below the surface. And those little particles you see floating around there are rich with nutrients.
Before we get to the bottom, you need to understand what you're actually looking at when you look at Lake Tahoe. This is not a normal lake. It sits on the border of California and Nevada, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it was born out of violence. About 2 million years ago, a chunk of the Earth's crust between two mountain ranges dropped straight down, the way a trapdoor drops. The Sierra Nevada rose on one side. The Carson Range rose on the other. The floor in between sank, and water poured in and never left. What you end up with is a lake that's roughly 22 miles long and 12 miles wide, sitting more than 6,000 feet above sea level, holding an amount of water that's almost impossible to picture. Try this. If you drained Lake Tahoe evenly across the entire state of California, it would cover the whole state more than a foot deep. That's the volume we're talking about, and it's deep. At its lowest point, near Crystal Bay on the north shore, the lake floor sits about 1,645 feet below the surface. In the United States, only Crater Lake in Oregon goes deeper. That depth is the whole reason this story exists, because depth changes everything about what happens to water, and of anything that sinks into it. Below around 700 feet, the water in Lake Tahoe sits at a nearly constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit all year, every year. That's not a coincidence. 39 degrees is the exact temperature where fresh water reaches its maximum density, which means that water doesn't rise or mix easily with the layers above it. It just sits there, locked in place, cold and heavy and still. Winter or summer doesn't matter down there. It's always the same temperature, always the same darkness, always the same crushing pressure. That combination, extreme cold, high pressure, low oxygen, almost no light, slows down decomposition dramatically. It doesn't stop it completely. This is the detail that a lot of the old campfire stories get wrong. Lake Tahoe is not a magic preservation chamber, but it is a lake where a body, a boat, or a fallen tree can sit recognizable for years, sometimes decades, in conditions that would break it down in a matter of weeks almost anywhere else. That single fact is the seed of nearly every legend this lake has ever produced. And in 2011, one of those legends collided directly with reality that in July of 1994, a Reno city planner named Donald Windecker went scuba diving off Rubicon Point on Tahoe's west shore. He was 44 years old. He went under the surface, and he never came back up. His dive partners reported him missing within hours. Search crews worked the area for days, and eventually the search was called off. Tahoe's cold. Its depth and its steep underwater slopes make it one of the hardest lakes in the country to recover a diver from once they had gone below a certain point. Windecker was presumed to be somewhere on the bottom, permanently, and there was nothing anyone could do about it for 17 years. That was the end of the story. Then, in 2011, a team of technical divers using specialized mixed gas equipment pushed past normal recreational limits in that same stretch of water and found a body resting on a rock ledge 265 feet down. It was still dressed in scuba gear. It was intact enough that investigators could tell, just by looking, that it was human remains. A remotely operated vehicle was brought in to recover it safely, and dental records confirmed what everyone suspected. It was Donald Windecker that he had been sitting at 265 feet in 39-degree water for almost 2 decades. The cold had done exactly what the old stories claimed the lake could do. It had kept him recognizable enough, after 17 years, for a positive identification. The medical examiner was even able to rule out foul play based on the condition of the remains. This case is important for 2 reasons. First, it proved the science was real. Tahoe genuinely can preserve a body far longer than a normal lake would. But second, and just as important, it proved the science only applied to real, documented cases like this one, not to the wilder version of the legend, the one where the lake floor is supposedly stacked with mob victims in cement shoes. Journalists and dive teams have gone looking for that specific story for decades. Fact-checking organizations have investigated it repeatedly. Nobody has ever found it. What Tahoe actually preserves is smaller, sadder, and far more specific than the myth. One diver, one confirmed case, not a graveyard. But the lake didn't stop at preserving people. It also preserved something much bigger that in 1896, a steamship called the SS Tahoe was launched onto the lake. She was 169 feet long, built for a lumber businessman, and for more than 40 years she carried passengers, mail, and cargo between the resort towns dotting the shoreline. People called her the Queen of the Lake. By the late 1930s, she was outdated, and the family that owned her made an unusual choice. Instead of scrapping her, they decided to sink her on purpose in fairly shallow water near Glenbrook on the east shore, so that glass-bottomed tour boats could show tourists a sunken ship without anyone having to dive for it. The plan didn't survive contact with the lake floor. Whoever mapped out the site underestimated just how steep the slope drops away at Glenbrook. When the crew opened the hull to the water in August of 1940, the ship didn't settle gently at the planned depth. She slid, picking up speed on the incline, and by the time she came to rest, her bow was sitting around 360 feet down and her stern was closer to 475 feet. She sat there, completely unseen and untouched. For 6 to 2 years at IN 2002, a technical diving team finally reached her using specialized gas mixtures and carefully planned decompression schedules. What they found when their lights hit the hull was almost unbelievable. The brass fittings were still bright. The wood paneling inside the cabins hadn't rotted away. You could still read painted lettering on the hull. A ship that had been resting at the bottom of a freezing lake for over 60 years looked, in places, like it had been sunk a few months earlier at IN 2004, the SS Tahoe became the first shipwreck in Nevada listed on the National Register of Historic Places. She's still down there right now, the largest intact underwater artifact in the entire lake, sitting on that same slope in water cold enough to keep her from falling apart. She's not alone. Other vessels have gone down in Tahoe over the decades, some scuttled on purpose, some lost in storms, some deliberately burned and towed out to the middle of the lake to sink, and smaller wooden boats litter parts of the lake floor near Emerald Bay, which California eventually protected as the state's first underwater park. Small barges and pleasure craft from the early 20th century are scattered across that stretch of shoreline, most of them never fully mapped or catalogued. But every one of those wrecks was put there by people who knew exactly what they were doing at a location and depth they at least intended to control. The next discovery in Tahoe's story is different, because nobody put it there, nobody planned it, and nobody had any idea it existed until the water itself gave it away in the 1930s, during one of the worst droughts California had seen in generations. The water level in Lake Tahoe and a smaller nearby lake called Fallen Leaf Lake dropped so far that things started appearing along the shoreline that hadn't been visible in living memory. Researchers documented old tree stumps near the shore, still rooted exactly where they had grown, now exposed by the falling water. Later carbon dating placed some of those stumps at several thousand years old. The story got stranger decades later. In the early 2000s, a professor kept snagging his fishing line on something underwater at Fallen Leaf Lake and eventually decided to investigate properly. What he found, working alongside researchers from a major oceanographic institution, was an entire forest of pine trees still standing upright on the lake floor, rooted exactly where they had grown. Some of those trees dated back over 1,000 years. Others were even older. These weren't logs that had drifted to the bottom and happened to land upright. They had grown there, on dry land, along an ancient shoreline, back when the lake sat hundreds of feet lower than it does today. What that tells scientists is that the Sierra Nevada once went through a mega-drought, a period lasting roughly 2 centuries during the medieval era when almost no rain fell. The lake shrank dramatically, and forests spread down into ground that's now permanently underwater. When the rain finally came back, it came back fast enough that the trees drowned standing up before they ever had the chance to fall over. This isn't just an interesting historical footnote. It's a warning. If a 200-year megadrought severe enough to drop Tahoe's water level by hundreds of feet happened within the last 1,000 years or so, then the assumption that California's water supply is stable over long time frames is resting on a fairly short and fairly lucky stretch of history. The trees are physical proof that the dry stretch happened before. Nothing rules out it happening again. Not every hidden chapter of Tahoe's past is under the water, though. Some of the most important history here happened right on the shoreline, and most people who visit the lake today have never been told about it. From roughly 1870 to 1890, the Tahoe Basin supplied an enormous amount of the timber that fed the silver mines of the Comstock Lode in nearby Nevada. Logs were floated down wooden flumes from the mountainsides to mills along the shore, and the labor force that built and ran that entire operation was overwhelmingly Chinese immigrants. By the 1880s, the largest concentration of Chinese workers in the whole basin lived in communal camps at Glenbrook, complete with their own gardens and cordwood operations. Archaeologists working with federal land agencies have since identified dozens of separate work campsites scattered across the basin from that era. What happened to those communities is the part that gets left out of the postcards. Anti-Chinese violence in the Sierra Nevada during this period was frequent and sometimes deadly. In one well-documented incident near Truckee in the 1870s, a Chinese work camp was attacked, cabins were burned, and workers were shot at as they tried to flee. A decade later, the town of Truckee organized a coordinated economic boycott against every Chinese-owned business and every business that employed Chinese workers, a strategy that became so effective it was studied and copied by other towns across the American West as a way to drive out immigrant communities without resorting to open violence. Within a matter of months, one of the largest Chinese populations in the entire Sierra Nevada had been almost completely forced out. There's no credible historical evidence that any of those workers ended up in the lake, despite some of the internet rumors that circulate around Tahoe. The real history is more mundane and honestly more troubling than a rumor about bodies underwater. These were real people who built the infrastructure that made this region possible, and they were pushed out by boycotts, intimidation, and the threat of violence, so thoroughly that most modern visitors have no idea they were ever here at all. The human history is heavy. The geology underneath it might be heavier. Running the length of the lake basin, underneath the deepest water, is an active fault line called the West Tahoe Fault. Researchers studying the fault estimate that it produces a major earthquake, somewhere around magnitude 7, roughly every 3,000 to 4,000 years. Based on that pattern, the most recent big rupture happened a few thousand years ago, which means, statistically, the next one is somewhere in the range of overdue. Here's why that matters more here than almost anywhere else. If a major earthquake happens directly underneath a lake this deep, it doesn't just shake the ground. It can displace an enormous volume of water almost instantly, and that displacement creates a wave. Researchers who modeled this scenario for Tahoe estimate that an initial wave could realistically reach somewhere between 10 and 30 feet in height, moving fast enough to reach shoreline towns within just a few minutes of the quake, and the wave wouldn't be a one-time event. In an enclosed basin like this, water slushes back and forth for hours afterward in a phenomenon called a sage, sending repeated waves into the same shoreline again and again long after the initial shock. Tens of thousands of people live along Tahoe shoreline today, in hotels, casinos, ski resort base areas, and residential neighborhoods, most of them within a few minutes' walk of the water. Because nobody alive has experienced an event like this on this lake, there's essentially no dedicated evacuation infrastructure built specifically for it, and this has actually happened before on a scale that's hard to picture. At some point in the last several thousand to tens of thousands of years, a massive chunk of the lake's western shoreline gave way in an underwater landslide, dumping roughly a cubic mile of rock and sediment into the lake in one event. Some researchers estimate that landslide could have produced a wave approaching 300 feet in height, tall enough to have swept over ridgelines that today hold entire neighborhoods. Nobody debates whether it happened. The debris field is still sitting there on the lake floor today, mapped and measured by sonar surveys. The exact date is still being studied and argued over by different research teams. But the conditions that cause it, a steep, unstable slope, sitting directly on an active fault underneath a massive volume of water, haven't gone anywhere. They are still down there right now in exactly the same configuration. It's worth being clear about what this actually means and doesn't mean. Nobody is saying a Tahoe tsunami is imminent, or that it will happen this year or this decade. Earthquake cycles that span thousands of years don't work on a schedule precise enough to predict a specific date. What the research does establish is that the geological setup for an event like this exists, has produced destructive results before, and hasn't been engineered around in the way that coastal tsunami zones in places like Japan or the Pacific Northwest have been. That gap between geological risk and public awareness is the actual finding here, more than any specific countdown to disaster.